Poor virgin Maid ran away on her wedding night. What Billionaire did next. At midnight, Ethan Cross stirred awake in the darkness of his honeymoon suite. He reached across the bed for his wife, his hand finding only cold sheets. His eyes snapped open. The bathroom door stood ajar, lights off. He sat up, heart beginning to pound. "Lila?" Silence answered him. He threw back the covers and moved through the room, calling her name louder now. The balcony doors were locked from the inside. Her wedding dress still hung on the closet door where she'd carefully placed it hours earlier, smoothing the lace with reverent fingers. But her overnight bag was gone. Her phone gone. The woman he'd fought his entire family to marry had vanished without a trace. He rushed into the hallway, nearly colliding with the night security guard. "Mr. Cross, is everything all right?" "My wife. Have you seen my wife?" The guard's face went pale. He radioed downstairs and the response came back immediately. Mrs. Cross had left through the lobby entrance 40 minutes ago, carrying a small bag, and climbed into a waiting car that sped away before anyone could question her. Ethan stood frozen in that hallway, still wearing the clothes from their wedding reception just 6 hours earlier. This was his wedding night. They'd said their vows in front of 300 people. She'd looked into his eyes and promised forever. They danced, cut the cake, laughed with guests who celebrated their love. And now she was gone. Why would a bride flee at midnight after saying, "I do"? What secret was worth abandoning a marriage hours after it began? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Ethan Cross grew up in a 40-room mansion in Buckhead, Atlanta, surrounded by everything money could buy and nothing his heart actually needed. His father, a real estate mogul, died when Ethan was 12, leaving behind a fortune and a widow who channeled her grief into controlling every aspect of her son's life. Catherine Cross was a woman who believed social standing mattered more than happiness and that love was a luxury people like them couldn't afford. Ethan learned early to keep his true feelings hidden. He excelled at Harvard Business School, launched a revolutionary property management software company by 25, and became a billionaire before 30. On the outside, he was everything his mother wanted. Successful, polished, connected to the right families. But inside he felt hollow. He attended charity galas where women threw themselves at him, not for who he was, but for what his last name could give them. He sat through business dinners where everyone wanted something. He lived in rooms that echoed with emptiness. Then he met Lila Monroe on a Tuesday morning when she arrived to work as part of the housekeeping staff his property manager had hired. She was 23 with warm brown skin, natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, and eyes that actually saw him rather than his bank account. She hummed hymns while she worked, old gospel songs he remembered from childhood visits to his grandmother's church. She smiled at him like he was just a regular person. Like his money didn't matter. Like she could see straight through to the lonely kid who'd never really had a home, just a house. He started finding excuses to be wherever she was working. He'd ask her about her day, her family, her dreams. Lila came from the West Side, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses her entire life and died from breast cancer when Lila was 19. She'd put herself through community college, studying early childhood education, working multiple jobs to pay for it. She wanted to open a daycare someday in her old neighborhood, give kids a safe place to learn and grow. She talked about faith like it was the air she breathed. She believed God had a plan even when that plan included hardship. She had this way of making poverty sound like it had taught her something valuable rather than stolen something from her. For 6 months, they built a friendship that slowly became something neither of them expected. Ethan would sit in the kitchen while she prepared his meals, listening to her talk about the sermon from her church. She'd challenge his cynicism with her hope, his isolation with her warmth. When his mother was away on her European trips, they'd talk for hours. He learned she'd never been in a serious relationship because most men in her world either wanted to use her or couldn't handle that she planned to stay celibate until marriage. Her faith wasn't performance. It was who she was, down to her bones. The first time Ethan told her he was falling in love with her, they were standing in his home library at midnight. She'd stayed late helping him prepare for a presentation, making sure he ate dinner, asking questions about his work like it actually mattered to her. When he said the words, she froze. She reminded him of the gulf between their worlds, the impossibility of it all. His mother would never accept her. His social circle would mock him. She had nothing to offer him but herself, and that couldn't possibly be enough. But Ethan had spent his whole life surrounded by people who offered him everything except what he actually needed. Someone who saw him. Someone who cared about his soul more than his stock portfolio. someone who made him want to be better, kinder, more faithful. He told her that night that he didn't care about his mother's approval or society's expectations. He wanted her. Only her. Forever. It took Lila 3 weeks of prayer, fasting, and long conversations with her pastor before she said yes. She loved him too, deeply and completely, but she needed to be sure this was God's will and not just her own desire. When she finally agreed to date him, she set clear boundaries. They would honor God in their relationship. They would attend church together. They would wait until marriage for physical intimacy. Ethan, who'd never taken faith seriously before, started going to Wednesday night Bible study and Sunday services. He met with Pastor Davidson for counseling. He read scripture he'd ignored his whole life. He discovered something he never expected: peace. For 8 months they built something real. They'd have dates at restaurants Lila loved. They'd volunteer together at the homeless shelter where she'd been serving for years. He learned to pray before meals, to see his wealth as responsibility rather than privilege. She helped him reconnect with his grandmother, the only family member who'd never tried to control him. He watched Lila work with children at the church daycare, saw how natural she was with them, how they gravitated to her love and patience. He wanted that future. Kids, family, home. When Ethan proposed on a Sunday evening after church, in front of the congregation that had become his new community, Lila cried tears of joy and said yes without hesitation. Pastor Davidson announced their engagement would be short. 3 months. Both of them wanted to start their marriage right, and the pastor could see how much they loved each other. Catherine Cross, Ethan's mother, was in France when she heard the news. She flew back immediately, arriving at the mansion like a storm rolling in. The confrontation happened 3 days after the engagement announcement. Catherine found Lila in the garden, pruning roses in the early morning light. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. She told Lila directly that this marriage would destroy her son's reputation, damage his business relationships, and embarrass their family. She offered money first. $2 million to disappear quietly. When Lila refused without even considering it, Catherine's approach shifted. She asked Lila if she truly loved Ethan. When Lila said yes with her whole heart, Catherine posed a different question. Did Lila love him enough to want what was best for him, even if it meant breaking her own heart? Lila didn't understand where this was going, but something in Catherine's tone made her deeply uneasy. Catherine explained that people from Lila's background didn't understand how wealth worked, how enemies accumulated with success, how danger followed money. Then Catherine dropped her real weapon. Ethan's uncle, Robert Cross, his father's younger brother, had been waiting decades for Ethan to fail or fall so the family fortune could pass to Robert's side of the family. Robert had connections to people who did terrible things for money. Catherine claimed she'd received threats, that Robert was planning something catastrophic if this marriage happened. Something that would hurt not just Ethan but anyone Ethan loved. She said Lila was making her son vulnerable in ways he couldn't protect against. Lila felt sick but stood her ground. She'd pray about it. Trust God. Tell Ethan and let him handle his family. But Catherine shook her head slowly. If Lila told Ethan, he'd confront Robert directly, and that would trigger exactly what Robert wanted. Open warfare that would give him legal grounds to challenge Ethan's control of the family business. Catherine insisted the only way to keep Ethan safe was for Lila to leave without explanation. Make him believe she'd never loved him. Break his heart so completely he'd never come looking for her. Lila refused. She wasn't going to lie to the man she loved. She wasn't going to abandon him based on vague threats from a woman who'd opposed their relationship from the start. She walked away from Catherine that morning, shaken but determined. She called Pastor Davidson, told him about the conversation, asked for guidance. The pastor suggested she and Ethan accelerate the wedding timeline and get married quickly, before Catherine could create more obstacles. They moved the date up to 3 weeks away. Those 3 weeks were strange. Catherine became suddenly supportive, even helping with wedding preparations. She smiled at Lila. She spoke kindly. She attended the bridal shower at the church. Lila felt cautiously hopeful that perhaps Catherine had finally accepted their marriage. Perhaps God had changed her heart. Ethan was happier than Lila had ever seen him, counting down days like a kid before Christmas. The night before the wedding, Lila stayed at the church with her bridesmaids from the congregation. Catherine arrived around 9 in the evening, saying she wanted a private moment with her future daughter-in-law. The bridesmaids left them alone in the bridal suite. Catherine's entire demeanor changed the moment the door closed. Her face went cold, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She told Lila she'd made a mistake. That she'd underestimated how ruthless Robert could be. That he'd moved faster than she expected. Catherine showed Lila grainy photographs on her phone. Pictures of children, young kids in playgrounds and schoolyards. Catherine explained these were kids from the West Side neighborhood where Lila grew up, kids who attended the church daycare where Lila volunteered every Saturday. Robert had people watching them. The message was clear. If she insists, innocent children would pay the price. Lila felt the room spin. Catherine wasn't finished. She revealed that Robert had discovered something even Ethan didn't know yet. Lila was pregnant. About 6 weeks along. Was a mistake. It only happened once. A passionate afternoon, but it was enough, but Lila told no one about it. Catherine had secretly gotten access to Lila's medical records through a contact at the clinic Lila had visited the week before for what she thought was just fatigue. The pregnancy was twins. And Robert knew. He'd made specific threats. Catherine's voice was steady but urgent. She'd failed to protect her husband from the corruption in their family, watched him work himself to death trying to keep vultures like Robert away from their wealth. She wouldn't fail to protect her son and his unborn children. Lila had 2 choices. Stay with Ethan. Or disappear, carry them in secret, raise them somewhere Robert couldn't find them, and keep them safe until Robert was no longer a threat. Lila couldn't breathe. She asked why Catherine didn't just go to the police, expose Robert, protect them legally. Catherine laughed bitterly. Robert had judges, lawyers, connections that made him untouchable. Any legal action would take years and give him time to act first. The only way to protect those babies was to hide their existence completely. Make Robert believe everything fell apart, that there was no pregnancy, no heirs to threaten his eventual claim to the family fortune. Then Catherine said something that broke Lila completely. She admitted she'd been wrong about her. That she'd watched Lila change her son into a man of faith, kindness, and purpose. That she finally understood what real love looked like. But love sometimes meant sacrifice. Catherine promised she would help. Money in an untraceable account. New identity documents. A place to live far from Atlanta. Everything Lila needed to survive and raise the twins safely. But there was one condition. Lila could never tell Ethan the truth. Not about the pregnancy. Not about the threats. Not about where she was. Catherine would handle Robert, watch him, wait for the right moment to neutralize him. But that could take years, and Ethan knowing would compromise everything. He'd insist on fighting, on protecting Lila himself, and that would get them all in trouble. The only way this worked was if Ethan believed Lila had simply abandoned him. Let him hate her. Let him move on. Keep him safe through her absence. Lila spent 2 hours on her knees that night, praying with tears streaming down her face. She called her pastor, but Catherine had anticipated that and the call wouldn't go through. She was trapped in that bridal suite with a choice no woman should ever have to make. Marry the man she loved and risk her babies' lives, or become the villain in his story to save them all. She stayed. The wedding happened. The party was one of a kind that had everyone talking. Top-notch, but through it all, her heart raced. She thought of those children. She considered her babies. Considered her love for Ethan. Considered all that Catherine said. At 2 in the morning, Lila made her decision. She changed out of her wedding nightgown, tore the dress hanging in the corner to make it look like there'd been a struggle, and sneaked out of the room. A car was waiting in the parking lot, driver ready to take her to a new life. As the vehicle pulled away, Lila looked back one last time. She whispered a prayer that God would help Ethan forgive her someday. That he'd understand she loved him enough to become the person he'd hate most in the world. That her sacrifice would mean something. She didn't know that Ethan, before he slept, was reading the scripture and thanking God for bringing Lila into his life. She remembered his vows that made her teared up hours ago, words about how she'd saved him from emptiness and taught him what faith really meant. The morning after Lila disappeared, Ethan stood in that suite for 3 hours. Pastor Davidson tried to speak with him, but Ethan couldn't hear anything over the roaring in his ears. He'd been so sure. So absolutely certain that Lila loved him, that their faith was genuine, that God had brought them together. How could he have been so wrong about everything? Catherine was the one who finally led him out to the car. She held him while he broke down in the back seat, sobbing like he hadn't since childhood. She whispered that sometimes people weren't who we thought they were, that Lila must have been scared of the new life, the responsibilities, and panicked, that he dodged a bullet. Those words turned his grief into rage. By the time they reached the mansion, Ethan had locked his heart down completely. He hired private investigators to find her. Not to reconcile, he told himself, but to get answers. To understand why. The investigators found nothing. No credit card usage. No phone records. No social media activity. Lila Monroe had vanished as completely as if she'd never existed. Ethan threw himself into work with frightening intensity. He expanded his company, acquired competitors, made strategic decisions that increased his wealth exponentially. He stopped going to church. Stopped praying. He dated occasionally, cold arrangements that never went past a few dinners. He never let anyone close again. Catherine watched her son harden into someone she barely recognized. She'd saved him, she told herself. Protected him and his unborn children from Robert's schemes. But the cost was watching Ethan lose the joy, the faith, the warmth that Lila had brought out in him. She kept tabs on Lila through intermediaries, making sure the monthly deposits reached her account, confirming the twins were born healthy. A boy and a girl. Beautiful babies with Ethan's eyes and Lila's smile. Lila rebuilt her life in Asheville, North Carolina, working under her new identity as a daycare teacher. She gave birth to Caleb and Naomi at a small community hospital, holding them and crying for everything they'd lost. Everything she'd stolen from them. A father who would have loved them completely. Wealth that could have given them every advantage. Family gatherings and cousins and grandparents. She gave them faith instead, raising them in a tiny church where the congregation became their family. She read them Bible stories every night. Taught them to pray before meals. Told them their daddy loved them very much but couldn't be with them right now because bad people were trying to hurt their family. The twins grew up understanding they had a father somewhere who didn't know they existed. It was their secret, their burden to carry. Caleb, serious and protective even at 4 years old, would ask when they could meet their daddy. Naomi, gentle and intuitive, seemed to sense her mother's sadness and would climb into her lap offering comfort. Lila watched them grow and felt the ache of Ethan's absence every single day. She kept one photo of him hidden in her Bible, looking at it late at night when the loneliness felt unbearable. Meanwhile, Catherine was executing her long-term plan. She quietly gathered evidence of Robert's illegal activities, his connections to organized crime, his embezzlement from family trusts. She worked with federal investigators who'd been building a case against some of Robert's associates. She waited for the perfect moment to spring the trap. But then, 4 years after Lila disappeared, Catherine suffered a major stroke. The kind that gave you weeks, maybe months if you were lucky. From her hospital bed, Catherine called Lila through the secure phone line she'd maintained. She confessed everything. Told Lila the full truth about Robert's threats, about the evidence she'd collected, about her plan that was now falling apart because she was dying. She begged Lila to take the children to Ethan now, before Robert realized Catherine was no longer protecting them. She said her greatest regret was forcing Lila to sacrifice her love, stealing 5 years from Ethan and his children. Catherine died 2 weeks later. Her will included provisions that would trigger Robert's investigation once her lawyers executed certain clauses. But it would take time, maybe 6 months, for everything to unfold. In her final instructions, she'd left a letter for Ethan explaining everything, stored with her attorney to be delivered only after Robert was safely behind bars. She'd also left a substantial trust for the twins, insurance policies, assets that would ensure they'd be taken care of no matter what happened. Lila spent 3 weeks in agony trying to decide what to do. The woman who'd forced her to run was now telling her to return. Catherine's death meant Ethan's protection was gone. Robert might start looking for vulnerabilities again. But more than that, Catherine's final words haunted her. Those children deserve their father. And Ethan deserves to know the truth. I stole 5 years from all of you. Don't let me steal any more. Lila prayed constantly. She talked with her pastor in Asheville, a kind older woman who'd mentored her through single motherhood. The pastor reminded her that faith meant trusting God even when the path looked terrifying. That hiding forever wasn't protecting her children, it was keeping them from half of who they were. That Ethan deserved the choice Catherine had stolen from him 5 years ago. So Lila made arrangements. She drove back to Atlanta with Caleb and Naomi, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. She went to the one person she knew would help her, even after everything. Ethan's grandmother, Josephine Cross, who'd been the only family member to truly celebrate Ethan and Lila's engagement. The older woman opened her door, saw Lila standing there with 2 children who had Ethan's exact eye color, and understood immediately. If this story has your heart racing, comment, I'm still watching below. Let's see who's truly following until the end. Josephine brought Lila and the twins into her home without hesitation. She listened to the entire story, tears streaming down her face. She was furious with Catherine for orchestrating such cruelty, even if the intentions were protective. She held Naomi and Caleb close, her great-grandchildren she'd been denied knowing. Then she called Ethan, telling him to come over immediately, that something urgent required his attention. That's how Ethan found himself standing in his grandmother's foyer on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, staring at two children who looked exactly like him at that age. When Naomi whispered that he was their daddy, Ethan's entire world tilted. He couldn't process it, couldn't breathe. Then he saw Lila in the doorway, and 5 years of buried grief and rage exploded to the surface. He demanded answers. His voice was cold, controlled fury that made even Josephine step back. Why did she run? Why keep his children from him? How dare she show up now acting like she had any right to do all she did? Lila stood there taking his anger, tears running down her face, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. Not until Robert was arrested. Not until she knew they were truly safe. Josephine intervened. She told Ethan that Lila had her reasons, that everything would be explained soon, but first he needed to meet his children properly. Caleb and Naomi were scared by their father's anger, clinging to their mother. Ethan saw their fear and something in him cracked. He knelt down to their level, forcing his voice gentle. He told them he was sorry for shouting, that he was just surprised that he'd always wanted kids. Naomi studied his face seriously, then said, "Mommy cries about you at night. She says she had to keep us safe." Ethan looked up at Lila, saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the weight she'd been carrying. He told his grandmother he was taking all of them to the mansion, that they'd stay there until this was sorted out. It wasn't a request. He needed answers, and he wasn't letting Lila disappear again until he got them. The first week was tense. Ethan arranged for DNA testing immediately, even though looking at Caleb and Naomi left no doubt they were his. The results confirmed it. He consulted with his lawyers about custody arrangements, his tone businesslike and cold whenever he spoke to Lila directly. But with the kids he was different. Patient. Curious. He'd sit with them during meals, asking about their favorite things, their friends in Asheville, their life without him. Caleb was quiet but observant, protective of his mother and sister. He'd position himself between Ethan and Lila during conversations, a tiny warrior guarding his family. Naomi was more open, drawn to Ethan's gentleness with her. She'd show him drawings she'd made, tell him stories from Sunday school, ask if he knew Jesus. That question cut Ethan deeper than anything else. His daughter wanted to know if he had faith, and he'd abandoned it the night Lila ran. Lila worked quietly in the mansion again, staying in a guest wing with the children. She cooked meals, cleaned spaces, fell back into old routines. She'd pass Ethan in hallways and the tension was suffocating. He wanted to scream at her, make her feel the pain she'd caused. But every time he opened his mouth to unleash that fury, one of the twins would appear and he'd swallow the words. Strange things started happening. Security cameras would glitch. The front gate would be found open when it should have been locked. Caleb mentioned seeing a man watching them from the garden, though security footage showed nothing. Ethan increased protection, hired additional personnel, but felt increasingly uneasy. Someone was interested in his suddenly discovered children, and he didn't know why. Then Josephine showed up with Catherine's attorney. The man carried a sealed letter and a flash drive. He explained that Catherine's will included instructions for this delivery, to occur 6 months after her death or upon the event of Ethan reuniting with Lila Monroe and the children. The timing was now. Ethan opened the letter with shaking hands. Catherine's confession poured out in her elegant handwriting. Everything about Robert's threats. The photographs of children in danger. The impossible choice she'd forced on Lila. The pregnancy Lila hadn't even known about when she ran. The years of gathering evidence against Robert. Her regret, deep and consuming, for stealing 5 years from Ethan and his children. She explained that the flash drive contained all the evidence needed to put Robert away, already provided to federal prosecutors who were building their case. Ethan read the letter 3 times, each pass making him feel sicker. His mother had done this. Threatened the woman he loved, weaponized unborn children, orchestrated this entire nightmare to protect him from an uncle he barely even knew. Lila hadn't run because she stopped loving him. She'd run because loving him meant protecting his children at any cost, even her own reputation and happiness. He found Lila in the garden where she'd been weeding the rose beds, old habits dying hard. He sat down next to her, letter still in his hand. He asked her why she didn't tell him before now, why she carried this alone. Lila finally spoke the full truth. That Catherine made her promise never to tell until Robert was arrested. That his mother claimed knowing would put him in danger, make him do something rash that Robert could exploit. That she'd kept silent for 5 years waiting for this moment, raising their children alone, letting him hate her because it meant keeping them all alive. Ethan felt tears he'd held back for years finally break through. He'd lost 5 years with his children because his mother thought she was protecting him. He'd spent 5 years believing the woman he loved had betrayed him when she'd actually sacrificed everything for him. The weight of that realization was crushing. Lila reached out hesitantly, touching his hand. She told him she understood if he couldn't forgive her, that she'd accepted long ago he might hate her forever. But she wanted him to know their children, let them have their father, even if she had to disappear again afterward. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her for the first time since that awful wedding day. Saw the woman who'd given up everything to protect his babies. Who'd lived in poverty when she could have taken Catherine's bribe and disappeared with millions. Who'd raised children to know faith and love and prayer even while carrying unbearable pain. Who taught Caleb and Naomi about a father they'd never met, kept his memory alive for them, refused to let them grow up bitter. He told her he didn't hate her. That he tried to, desperately, because it was easier than admitting he'd never stopped loving her. That every woman he'd dated for 5 years was measured against her and found wanting. That he'd built an empire but his life still felt empty because she wasn't in it. Lila broke down completely. 5 years of held grief poured out in wrenching sobs. Ethan pulled her close, holding her while she cried for everything they'd lost, everything they'd been forced to sacrifice. He told her he understood why she ran. That if someone had threatened his children's lives, he would have done the same thing. That she'd been impossibly brave, carrying that burden alone. That he was sorry he hadn't been there, sorry she'd faced pregnancy and childbirth and years of single parenthood because his family was corrupt and dangerous. The following week moved quickly. Federal prosecutors arrested Robert Cross on multiple charges including conspiracy and money laundering. The evidence Catherine had collected was enough. Robert's connections to organized crime, his embezzlement schemes, his documented threats against family members. He'd be going to prison for decades. The danger that had haunted them for 5 years evaporated in a single morning. Ethan threw himself into making up for lost time. He converted a wing of the mansion into a space designed for children. Bright colors, toys, books, everything Caleb and Naomi could want. He enrolled them in an excellent private school near the mansion. He arranged for Lila to finally open that daycare she'd always dreamed about, funding the entire project and ensuring it would serve the West Side neighborhood where she grew up. But more than the material things, Ethan worked on rebuilding relationship. He started attending church again. Pastor Davidson, older now but still serving, welcomed him back with open arms. The pastor had known something was wrong that wedding day, that Lila wouldn't have run without serious cause. He'd prayed for them both every week for 5 years, trusting God had a plan even when it looked hopeless. Ethan relearned faith. Not the surface-level belief he'd adopted when dating Lila before, but deep trust forged through suffering. He prayed with his children before bed. Read Bible stories to Naomi. Talked with Caleb about forgiveness and grace. He and Lila started counseling with Pastor Davidson, working through trauma and loss and the complicated process of rebuilding trust after years of forced separation. There were hard days. Moments when Ethan would feel overwhelming grief for the years stolen from him. He'd missed Lila's pregnancy, the twins' birth, their first words and first steps. He'd missed 5 years of bedtime stories and scraped knees and childhood laughter. Sometimes the anger at his mother would surge up, fierce and bitter, and he'd have to actively choose forgiveness over resentment. Lila struggled too. Years of fear didn't just vanish because Robert was arrested. She'd wake up panicking that something would happen to the twins. She'd spent so long hiding that living openly felt dangerous. Therapy helped. So did Josephine, who'd become a constant presence, making up for lost time with her great-grandchildren and supporting Lila through the adjustment. The older woman would sit with Lila on hard days, reminding her that Catherine's choices didn't define her worth, that she'd been a victim of impossible circumstances, that surviving had taken remarkable strength. 6 months after Robert's arrest, Ethan asked Lila a question while they were watching Caleb and Naomi play in the garden. Would she be willing to try again? Not rush back to where they were, but slowly rebuild what they'd started building 6 years ago. Attend counseling. Let their relationship develop naturally while co-parenting. Give love a second chance. Lila said yes, but with one condition. They had to do this right before God. She'd compromised nothing about her faith during their separation, and she wouldn't start now. That meant boundaries and accountability. Ethan learned to be present, not just provide. He coached Caleb's youth soccer team. He helped Naomi with her reading homework. He showed up not as the billionaire but as dad. He and Lila talked for hours about everything they'd been through. She told him about the pregnancy, how terrifying it was facing it alone, how she'd sob in the hospital after giving birth wishing he could meet his babies. He told her about the darkness he'd fallen into, how close he'd come to losing himself completely, how angry he'd been at God for letting this happen. They talked about Catherine, working toward forgiveness for a woman who'd caused terrible pain while genuinely trying to protect them. Pastor Davidson watched them carefully, counseling them through every stage. He talked about how suffering could either destroy a relationship or forge it into something stronger than it ever could have been otherwise. Ethan adjusted his work schedule to prioritize family time. He'd arrive home by 6 for dinner, help with homework, read bedtime stories. He and Lila hosted Bible study in their home on Wednesday nights now. They established traditions. Sunday dinners with Josephine. Friday game nights with just their immediate family. Monthly service projects where they'd volunteer at homeless shelters or food banks, teaching Caleb and Naomi that wealth was responsibility, not privilege. The twins thrived, growing in confidence and security. Caleb remained protective but learned to relax, trust that his family was safe now. Naomi's gentle spirit blossomed, and she'd tell anyone who'd listen about how God answered her prayers for her mommy and daddy to be together. 2 years into their coming together, Lila gave birth to another daughter, Hope. The name was intentional, a declaration that even after years of darkness, life could still bring new beginnings. Ethan was present for everything this time. The pregnancy, the childbirth, the 3 a.m. feedings. Caleb and Naomi were incredible big siblings, gentle and patient with their baby sister. Watching them together, Ethan would think about how close he'd come to never knowing any of them. How Robert's greed almost destroyed this entire family. How his mother's fear almost prevented this joy. How Lila's courage had saved them all. Ethan reconnected with a few decent people in his extended family, carefully vetting anyone who wanted access to his children. He cut off relatives who'd sided with Robert or who showed any sign of viewing his kids as pawns in inheritance games. He built boundaries that protected what mattered most. Josephine remained the cornerstone of their family support, a constant presence of wisdom and unconditional love. Years passed. Caleb grew into a thoughtful teenager who wanted to study social work, help families struggling like his mother had struggled. Naomi showed artistic talent and a heart for worship, leading youth praise teams at church. Hope was a whirlwind of energy and curiosity, keeping everyone on their toes. Ethan and Lila added another son, Joshua, whose birth represented another layer of healing and joy. Their marriage wasn't perfect. They had arguments about parenting decisions, about balancing work and family, about how to handle Ethan's demanding business schedule. But they'd learned to fight fair, to pray together when tensions rose, to choose each other repeatedly even when it was difficult. They'd survived forced separation and years of pain. Normal marital disagreements felt manageable in comparison. Sometimes love means running toward each other. And sometimes it means running away to protect what you love most. Lila Monroe became the villain in Ethan Cross's story for 5 years, carrying the weight of his hatred and confusion, because love isn't always about staying. Sometimes it's about sacrificing your own happiness, your own needs for something greater than yourself. What would you have done in Lila's position? If someone threatened, would you have the courage to walk away from everything you'd ever wanted? Would you trust that God could redeem years of separation and pain? Could you love someone enough to let them hate you if it meant keeping them safe? And what about Ethan? Could you forgive someone who stole 5 years of your children's lives, even if they did it to protect those children? Catherine Cross made terrible choices driven by fear and control. She stole years from her son and grandchildren, forced impossible decisions on a young woman who deserved better. But in the end, even her flawed protection came from love. She gathered evidence for 5 years, working to neutralize Robert. She confessed her failures and tried to make things right before her death. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending the harm didn't happen. It means acknowledging both the damage and the complicated love that motivated it. Robert Cross represents the darkness that exists in some families. Greed so consuming it threatens. Power wielded without conscience. The kind of evil that forces good people into impossible corners. But even that darkness couldn't ultimately destroy what God was protecting. Justice came eventually. The truth emerged. The family Robert tried to destroy became stronger than he could have imagined. Caleb and Naomi grew up understanding that their early years were marked by sacrifice they didn't choose. But they also grew up surrounded by fierce love, unshakable faith, and parents who chose each other every single day despite everything they'd survived. They learned that family isn't just biology. It's showing up, protecting each other, working through hard things together. We're taught that love means never leaving, always staying, fighting for relationship no matter what. But sometimes love means letting go. True love isn't always convenient or comfortable or understood by people watching from the outside. Faith isn't believing God will prevent all suffering. It's trusting that He'll walk through it with you. Lila prayed for 5 years while raising twins alone, trusting that someday Ethan would understand. Ethan prayed through rage and grief and abandonment. Their story proves that even when circumstances scream that God has forgotten you, He's working in ways you cannot see. If you're watching this and you're in the middle of your own wilderness season, take heart. The separation you're experiencing might be protection you don't yet understand. The years that feel stolen might be producing strength you'll need for what's ahead. Don't give up. Keep choosing faith when circumstances make it look foolish. Keep believing redemption is possible even when everyone tells you to move on. What's your reaction to this story? Could you have forgiven like Ethan forgave? Could you have sacrificed like Lila sacrificed? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear that broken things can be restored, that love is stronger than fear, that faith persists even in darkness. If you made it to the end of this story, hit that like button if this moved you. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about faith, love, and the resilience of the human spirit. Click the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Until next time, remember that your story isn't over. God is still writing. And love, real sacrificial love, can survive anything. Thank you for watching, and may you find the courage to trust God's plan even when it breaks your heart.